golden autumn sun was still warm on Claire's neck when she pulled the old tweed jacket from the back of the closet. But the scrap of paper she found in the lining turned the air to ice. It wasn't just a hidden bank receipt. It was a key to a vault that shouldn't exist. An hour later, standing in the sterile chill of a private viewing room, Claire stared at a row of passports, each bearing her husband's face, but names she had never heard him speak. Beneath them lay 2 death certificates with official seals, and the faces staring back from the casualty photos were the same children she had just packed off to school with peanut butter sandwiches and a kiss. The drive home was a blur of shaking hands and missed turns, but the rearview mirror kept her grounded in a new, terrifying reality. A black van with windows like obsidian slabs followed her every move, mirroring her speed with the silent precision of a predator. Back in her pristine kitchen, the sound of Mark's key turning in the front door lock felt like the cocking of a hammer. As he stepped into the light, smoothing his silk tie and offering his usual boyish smile, Claire realized the man she had slept beside for 15 years wasn't a husband at all. He was a stranger playing a role in a house that had suddenly become a cage. Claire Danvers leaned her shoulder against the cool, white-painted wood of the doorframe, her lungs filling with a sharp, intoxicating scent of Naperville in October. It was a cocktail of decaying maple leaves and damp asphalt, the kind of smell that promised stability. The morning sun, a pale gold coin hanging over Illinois, shattered into 1,000 tiny diamonds across the dew-slicked lawn. Beside her, Mark adjusted the silk knot of his tie with practiced precision. He leaned in, his lips brushing her cheek with a dry, familiar warmth, before his briefcase latched shut with a metallic snap. Sophie and Leo, burdened by oversized backpacks that made them look like colorful beetles, scrambled toward the waiting yellow bus. The vehicle exhaled a thick cloud of diesel grit into the crisp air, a temporary blemish on the pristine suburban silence. Claire raised a hand, waving until the bus rounded the corner of the cul-de-sac. As the engine noise faded, the neighborhood returned to its rhythmic peace. The distant hum of a lawnmower and the soft, rhythmic patter of falling leaves. Claire smiled, the soft wool of her cashmere sweater hugging her skin, providing a sense of absolute, unshakable tranquility. She retreated into the house, the silence of the foyer wrapping around her like a shroud. In the master suite, the walk-in closet smelled of cedar planks and the heavy, expensive musk of Mark's cologne. Claire moved through the racks, her hands brushing against starch-stiffened shirts and wool blazers, intent on shifting the wardrobe for the coming frost. Her fingers snagged on a rough texture, a heavy tweed jacket Mark hadn't touched in 3 years. Habit took over. She reached into the pockets to ensure no stray pens or receipts would ruin the fabric at the dry cleaners. Her palm brushed against a stiff, crumpled scrap of paper tucked deep into the lining of the inner breast pocket. She pulled it out, smoothing the yellowed, brittle slip against the mahogany surface of the dresser. It was a bank receipt, dated years ago, stamped with the bold blue ink of the Naperville City Bank. Her eyes traced the fine print, a safe deposit box number, 402, and a signature that made her breath hitch. Mark's handwriting, bold, slanted, and unmistakable, stared back at her from the bottom of the form. Claire sat on the edge of the mattress, the receipt clutched so tightly her knuckles turned the color of bone. Memories flickered like a failing film reel. Their joint visits to the bank, the tedious discussions about mortgage rates, the meticulous planning of college savings accounts for Leo and Sophie. Mark was a man of folders and spreadsheets. He shared every financial minutia, or so she had believed for 15 years. A slow, creeping chill climbed her spine, an icy finger tracing the vertebrae. He had kept this box a secret. He had paid for it, maintained it, and never once mentioned its existence. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, usually a comforting heartbeat of the home, now sounded like a hammer against an anvil. She searched her mind for a breadcrumb, a stray comment about extra storage or legal papers, but found only a vast, echoing void. The bedroom, once her sanctuary of beige tones and soft light, suddenly felt crowded with shadows she couldn't name. The heavy glass doors of the bank yielded with a sigh of pressurized air, and Claire stepped into a climate-controlled chill that made the hair on her arms stand up. Her heels clicked against the polished marble floor, the sound echoing with an accusatory sharpness that drew the eyes of the tellers. She approached the counter, her voice thin and brittle as she presented her identification and the crumpled receipt. The clerk spent an eternity comparing signatures, his eyes darting between the screen and the paper, while Claire stared at her own hands, white-knuckled around the strap of her purse. Finally, the massive steel door of the vault groaned open. She followed the man into the bowels of the building, past rows of dull, brushed metal lockers that smelled of ozone and cold machinery. When the key turned in lock 402 with a heavy, final thud, Claire felt the air leave her lungs. Her palms were slick, the skin feeling tight and foreign against the cold metal of the box. The long metal drawer slid out onto the table of the small private viewing booth. Inside lay a thick leather portfolio, the hide cracked and smelling of old chemicals. Claire flipped it open, and a cascade of glossy, dark blue and burgundy booklets spilled onto the table. Passports. She picked up the top one, a British passport issued to a Thomas Walsh. From the photograph, Mark stared back at her. But it wasn't the man who kissed her goodbye that morning. This version of him wore a thick, unkempt beard and a gaze so predatory it made her stomach turn. She fumbled through the others: Canada, France, Australia. Each bore a different name, a different birth date, but the same face. Her husband. She ran a trembling finger over the laminated image, trying to find a trace of the man she knew beneath the aliases. The paper felt like dry ice against her skin, and the air in the tiny room grew so thick with the smell of old ink that she struggled to draw a full breath. Beneath the stack of identities, Claire found a heavy gray envelope. She slid out 2 sheets of paper bearing the official gold seal of the state of Illinois. Her vision blurred as the words "Certificate of Death" resolved on the page. 2 small photographs were clipped to the top. A boy with a stubborn cowlick at the crown of his head. A girl with deep, unmistakable dimples in her cheeks. The names written in the black ink were foreign, Rivers and Morgan. But the faces were those of Sophie and Leo. The documents claimed these children had died 6 years ago in a tragic house fire. Claire felt the small room begin to tilt, the walls leaning in at impossible angles. The pulse in her ears became a deafening roar, a rhythmic thudding that drowned out the hum of the air conditioning. She pressed her palm hard against her mouth to stifle a scream, her eyes locked on the ghostly, dead doubles of her own children. Her hands shook violently as she dug deeper into the portfolio, unearthing a series of financial statements. These weren't the modest savings accounts they used for summer vacations. They were ledgers of ghosts. Columns of figures documenting wire transfers from offshore entities in the Caymans to shell corporations in Delaware. Sums with 6 zeros, followed by the word settlement or acquisition. Mark's signature was everywhere, sprawling and confident, the ink looking so fresh she imagined she could still smell the chemicals of the pen. Consultancy services. One line read, "Asset liquidation." Noted another. Their entire life, the budget meetings, the clipping of coupons, the talk of tightening the belt, was a grotesque theater. Every digit on the page was a jagged shard of glass, cutting through the fabric of her reality until nothing was left but the cold, hard truth of a stranger's wealth. Claire burst out of the bank's lobby, the midday sun striking her eyes like a physical blow. She fumbled for her keys, her fingers clumsy and numb as she hurried across the shimmering asphalt of the parking lot. Once inside the car, she threw her bag onto the passenger seat and glanced into the rearview mirror. She froze. 2 rows back, a black Ford Transit sat idling. Its windows so heavily tinted they looked like slabs of obsidian. She shifted into gear and pulled onto the main road, her heart hammering against her ribs. The van followed, maintaining a precise, unvarying distance behind her. Sweat pooled between her shoulder blades, turning her silk blouse cold. She accelerated, weaving through the light traffic of downtown Naperville. But the black silhouette remained glued to her bumper. The familiar sounds of the city, the honking of horns, the chatter of pedestrians, muffled into an ominous drone. She jerked the steering wheel, diving into a labyrinth of narrow residential side streets. The tires of her SUV let out a sharp squeal as she rounded a corner, sending a spray of dry, brittle leaves into the air. She watched the mirror, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she turned again, then again, passing identical brick colonials and manicured hedges. Each time she thought she had lost him, the black van reappeared, gliding around the corner with a terrifying, predator-like grace. Her knees shook so hard she could barely maintain pressure on the pedals. When she finally swerved into her own driveway, the van didn't follow. It glided past the house and came to a halt at the very end of the street. A silent, dark sentinel. Claire stayed in the car, the engine ticking as it cooled, her eyes fixed on the black metal box that sat like a crouched beast in the middle of her perfect neighborhood. Inside the kitchen, Claire stood at the granite island, her movements mechanical as she began to prep dinner. The knife thudded against the wooden cutting board with a frantic, uneven rhythm. She watched her own hands, fascinated by the way her fingers trembled as they sliced through a bell pepper. The aroma of sautéing onions and garlic, usually the scent of evening comfort, now smelled like rot. She set the table, meticulously aligning the forks and knives until they were perfectly parallel. A desperate attempt to impose order on a world that had just dissolved. The sound of a key turning in the front door lock made her jump so violently the knife clattered to the floor. Mark's footsteps in the hallway sounded heavier, more deliberate than they had this morning. Claire sucked in a lungful of air, forced her shoulders down, and painted a fragile, brittle smile onto her face. Claire sat across from him, her eyes tracking every movement of his fork as he calmly ate a piece of roast beef. Under the warm glow of the dining room chandelier, Mark's face looked different. Less like her husband and more like a waxen effigy. She noticed a thin, jagged scar behind his ear, a detail she had somehow missed for over a decade. His eyes, usually a warm brown, seemed to have flattened into 2 cold, dark discs. When he asked her how her day was, his voice was the same smooth baritone she had always loved, but now she heard the hollow resonance of a lie. He was a man playing a role, a master of mimicry who had built a life out of stolen identities and dead children. The silence between them grew heavy, a physical weight that pressed against her chest as she realized she was sharing a meal with a ghost. Later that night, Claire lay in bed, her eyes wide and staring at the ceiling. Beside her, Mark's breathing was deep and rhythmic, the sound of a man with a clear conscience. She waited until his snoring turned into a heavy, consistent drone before she slid out from under the covers. She moved onto the balls of her feet, navigating the hallway with the stealth of a thief. Every floorboard seemed to groan under her weight, a series of sharp cracks that sounded like gunshots in the dead of night. She slipped into Mark's office, the air in the room smelling of stale coffee and the cold, chemical scent of old leather. She sank into his high-backed chair and pulled his laptop onto her lap. The silver metal was ice cold against her skin. She reached into her robe and pulled out a small USB drive she had bought at a drugstore earlier. As she slid it into the port, the tiny click felt like a thunderclap. The blue light of the screen illuminated her face, highlighting her dilated pupils and the frantic tremor in her hands. The screen flickered, a cascade of green code scrolling down the black background as the bypass software worked. When the desktop finally opened, Claire was met with a wall of data that made her head spin. Folders were labeled with strings of alphanumeric characters, but when she opened the first one, a gallery of faces appeared. Men with hard, scarred faces and eyes that had seen too much. Next to each photo were notes on biometric reset and new SSN. The word cleansed was stamped in a violent red font across dozens of profiles. Claire's nightgown was damp with cold sweat. Mark wasn't just a security consultant, he was a ghost maker. He took the worst the world had to offer, mercenaries, arms dealers, predators, and gave them the one thing money usually couldn't buy: a clean past. She scrolled through the list of monsters, her breath coming in shallow hitches, terrified that she might see a face she recognized from a neighbor's barbecue. Her mouse hovered over a folder simply titled Domestic. Inside, she found the digital wreckage of the life she thought she owned. There were scanned reports from the Witness Protection Program dated 6 years ago. Her heart stopped as she read the names: Sophie Emma Rivers and Leo James Morgan. There were photos of their biological parents, a woman with Sophie's eyes, a man with Leo's chin, both listed as deceased, no next of kin. Mark hadn't adopted them. He had intercepted them. He had taken 2 broken pieces of a failed government program and used them as props to build a family that would serve as his ultimate camouflage. Claire pressed her hand to her sternum, her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird in a cage. The house around her, the memories of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, all of it was a stage set, and she was the only one who hadn't known she was an actor. A sharp, metallic rasp from the backyard cut through the silence, making Claire's blood turn to slush. She lunged for the security monitor on the desk, her fingers fumbling with the controls. The grainy black and white feed showed the rear patio. A man in a dark hoodie and a sky mask was crouching by the sliding glass doors, a heavy pry bar in his hand. Claire watched, paralyzed, as the intruder worked the lock. In the moonlight, she saw the glint of a long blade tucked into the man's waistband. The sound of the metal scraping against the glass was a high-pitched shriek in her ears. She clamped her hand over her mouth to stop herself from screaming, her eyes darting between the monitor and the heavy oak door of the office. The office door creaked open, and Mark was there. He wasn't wearing his pajamas. He was in a dark tactical sweater and trousers, his movements fluid and silent. He didn't look at the laptop or at Claire. He looked at the monitor. He pulled a suppressed handgun from a holster at his small of back with a terrifying lack of hesitation. Claire watched him on the screen as he stepped out of the side door. The confrontation was over in seconds. Mark moved with the efficiency of a machine, neutralizing the intruder before the man could even raise his weapon. There was no struggle, no shouted warnings. Just a series of muffled thuds and a wet, sickening sound that made Claire's stomach turn. When Mark stepped back into the office minutes later, his face was as calm as if he had just checked the mail. He looked at Claire, his eyes cold and empty, and she knew then that the man she loved had never existed. The next morning, Claire stood by the window of the upstairs landing, her fingers white as they gripped the sill. Below, the neighborhood was waking up. A jogger passed by, their breath fogging in the cool air. But on their lawn, near the edge of the rose bushes, was a dark, irregular patch of earth. It looked like someone had spilled a bucket of rust-colored paint. Claire Claire knew it was blood. Mark was downstairs, whistling a jaunty tune as he flipped pancakes for the children. The smell of maple syrup drifted up the stairs, thick and cloying. She felt a wave of vertigo. The world was continuing as if nothing had happened, as if a man hadn't been slaughtered in their backyard hours ago. She was trapped in a beautiful suburban cage with a predator who called her Honey. The day of the annual Naperville garden party arrived with a cruel, mocking brightness. Claire stood on the back veranda, the heat of the afternoon sun prickling her skin. She held a glass of lemonade, the ice cubes rattling against the glass as her hand shook. Around her, the cream of Naperville society mingled in their linen suits and floral dresses. Mark was the center of attention, standing behind a large silver punch bowl, laughing as he ladled out a bright red concoction. He looked every bit the successful businessman, his smile wide and disarming. He clapped the local sheriff on the shoulder, leaning in to tell a joke that sent the lawman into a fit of wheezing laughter. The scent of char-grilled brisket and citrus zest filled the air, a sensory blanket designed to smother any hint of the darkness lurking beneath the surface. Claire's gaze drifted from the guests to the staff. There were new faces among the waiters, men with thick necks and eyes that never stopped moving. One waiter, a man with a buzz cut and a jagged scar across his knuckles, walked past her. He didn't offer her a napkin or a drink. He scanned the perimeter of the yard with a cold, professional detachment. She watched as these staff members took up positions at every exit, their hands resting near their waistbands. A tall man near the gate adjusted a small, translucent earpiece, his expression grim. They weren't there to serve food. They were a containment team. The realization hit Claire like a physical blow. The house wasn't just a home anymore. It was a fortress, and she was a prisoner of war. She waited for a gap in the crowd and slipped behind a towering hedge of arborvitae. The air was cooler here, smelling of damp earth and pine needles. She heard a low, raspy voice on the other side of the green wall. It was Mark, but the warmth was gone, replaced by a voice like grinding stones. He was speaking into a small black radio. "Transport is green," he said. "We move at 18 O's. I want the current asset neutralized and the secondary units prepped for deep cover transition." Claire's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Neutralized. The word echoed in her mind. He wasn't just moving them, he was erasing them. She felt a dry branch snap under her foot, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet alcove. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, praying the wind would mask the sound. The word evacuation burned in her mind like a brand. She had exactly 2 hours before their lives were deleted. Mark was going to strip them of their names, their history, and their freedom. He would turn them into ghosts, drifting through a series of safe houses and false identities, entirely dependent on his protection. She saw her future, a series of gray rooms and whispered conversations. Her children growing up in the shadow of a man who viewed them as tactical equipment. Her fingers dug into the bark of a maple tree, the rough texture biting into her skin. She wasn't going to let him do it. She couldn't. Claire turned and bolted for the house, her heart in her throat. She needed to get to the children, to find a way out before the clock struck 6. She reached the back door and tried to push past a waiter who was standing guard. He didn't budge. His chest was as solid as a brick wall. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to check on my daughter." The man looked down at her, his eyes like 2 pieces of flint. "Mr. Danvers said the children are to remain in the playroom for their safety, ma'am. The party is getting a bit crowded." His tone was polite, but his hand moved to block the doorway. Claire looked into his eyes and saw the truth. The waiter was a jailer, and the safety was a cell. She retreated, her mind racing. She needed a way to strike back, to use Mark's own world against him. She slipped into the guest bathroom and locked the door, leaning against the cool tile as she caught her breath. She reached behind the vanity, where she had hidden a burner phone she'd managed to secure weeks ago. Her fingers flew over the screen. She had spent the last few nights secretly copying files from Mark's laptop, uploading them to a secure cloud drive. Now, she hit send on an anonymous tip to the FBI's Chicago field office. The message contained the GPS coordinates of the house and a direct link to the dossiers of the criminals Mark had helped disappear. A second message went out to a contact she'd found in his Special Projects folder, a man named Victor Kowalski. She sent him a faked transcript of Mark offering to testify against him in exchange for federal immunity. She stepped back into the living room, her face a mask of calm. Mark was still at the punch bowl, the picture of suburban grace. Claire picked up a glass of red wine from a passing tray. As she walked toward him, she tripped over the rug, the dark liquid splashing across the pristine white linen tablecloth. It looked like an arterial spray. The guests gasped, and the guard's attention was momentarily pulled toward the mess. In the confusion, Claire slipped toward the back hallway. The smell of the wine, metallic and sour, clung to her clothes as she vanished into the shadows of the house. She found Sophie and Leo in the basement, where they were playing a board game of cards. "New game," she whispered, her voice tight. "We're playing Super Spies. We have to leave through the secret tunnel." She led them toward the small, high window that looked out onto the backyard. She helped Sophie climb onto a stack of storage bins, her hands shaking as she boosted the girl toward the narrow opening. "Go to the woods," she urged. "Don't stop until you see the big oak tree." Just as Leo was halfway through the window, the basement door was kicked open with a violence that shook the foundation. Mark stood at the top of the stairs, his silhouette framed by the harsh light of the hallway. He didn't look like a husband. He looked like a soldier. He was down the stairs in 3 strides, his hand clamping onto Claire's arm with a force that made her bones groan. "What are you doing, Claire?" he hissed, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He dragged her away from the window, his fingers digging into her skin. He looked at the children, his eyes devoid of any fatherly warmth. "Get down from there. Now. We're leaving." The smell of his cologne, once a comfort, now made her gag. He was a stranger, a monster who had stolen her life, and he was through playing house. "Whose children are they, Mark?" Claire screamed, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. She reached into her pocket and threw the death certificates at him. The papers fluttered through the air like wounded birds, landing at his feet. Mark froze, his face draining of color. Sophie and Leo stared at the photos of their own dead doubles, their eyes wide with a terror that no child should ever know. Mark's lip curled, his mind clearly racing to find a lie. But the silence stretched too long. The mask had finally cracked, and beneath it was nothing but a cold, calculating void. The world outside suddenly exploded into noise. The rhythmic thumping of helicopter rotors shook the house, the sound of physical weight that pressed against their eardrums. Bright, blue-white searchlights swept across the basement window, turning the shadows into jagged, shifting monsters. Tires screeched on the driveway, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of flashbangs detonating in the yard. The air in the basement became thick with the smell of cordite and ozone. Mark looked up, his eyes darting frantically as he realized the perimeter had been breached. The safety he had promised was gone, replaced by the overwhelming power of the law. The guards upstairs opened fire, the sound of automatic weapons fire rattling the floorboards above them. Claire didn't hesitate. As Mark turned toward the stairs, she lunged at him, her entire weight slamming into his side. They tumbled onto the cold concrete, a chaotic tangle of limbs. Claire scrambled away, grabbing Sophie and Leo and pulling them under the heavy oak workbench. She covered them with her own body, her heart thundering against their backs. Above them, the house was being torn apart. Plaster rained down from the ceiling as bullets chewed through the wood. Mark reached for his weapon, but Claire grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from the bench and swung it with everything she had. The impact was a dull thud, and Mark slumped to the floor, dazed. The basement door was blown off its hinges by a tactical charge, the blast sending a wave of heat and dust through the room. Men in black armor and helmets swarmed down the stairs, their weapon-mounted lights cutting through the gloom like lasers. "FBI, get down!" they roared. Mark was pinned to the floor before he could even blink, his face pressed into the dirt as the zip ties ratcheted shut around his wrists. Claire held the children tighter, her face buried in Sophie's hair as the agents surrounded them. The nightmare was over. But the silence that followed was even more terrifying. Claire walked out of the house into a world of strobe lights and screaming sirens. The neighborhood was a sea of blue and red. The pristine lawns of Naperville, now a staging ground for a federal raid. She saw Mark being led away, his head bowed, his expensive polo shirt torn and stained with dirt. He didn't look back. She sat on the bumper of an ambulance, a thick wool blanket draped over her shoulders, as a medic checked the children. The air smelled of smoke and spent gunpowder. She watched as the black van, the one that had followed her, was towed away, a dark relic of a life that had never been hers. She was cold, she was homeless, and she was alone. But as she looked at Sophie and Leo, she knew she had finally found something real. The illusion was dead, and for the first time in 15 years, Claire Danvers was finally awake.